Welcome to Larking Gowen Insights, accountancy and business advice for all, a series that gives you bite-sized tips and guidance on tax, funding, legislation, reforms and much more. With case studies, business advisory and sector specials and even interviews, our team of experts are committed to helping you navigate the world of accounting and finance with a variety of presenters from across our specialisms. So, let's get on with today's show.
Welcome, I'm Dominic Carter, tax partner here at Larking Gowen. Today I'm joined by Gilly McGill, who's our VAT Director, because the subject we're talking about today is the potential change in the VAT status of independent school fees. So this will be of interest to independent schools and the parents and families of people who attend them. Gilly, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
We're talking about the potential changes announced by the Labour Party, that in the event that they form a government following an election, potentially in the second half of this year, they have pledged to introduce VAT on independent school fees. Is that broadly right?
That is absolutely broadly right. So lots of ifs and buts and maybes. However, it's such a landscape change for the independent school sector that it does warrant some thinking about, even though it may never come to pass. So at the moment, independent schools who provide education for a fee are exempt from VAT. So they're not VAT registered. And they don't charge VAT to the families whose children attend those schools. And that's because they're what's called an eligible body for the purposes of education. And that definition of eligible body is quite a wide one. It includes universities, further education colleges. It includes local authorities, so your local county council that maintains schools. And it includes commercial providers where they are actually teaching English as a foreign language. But it also includes certain not-for-profit organisations. So that will include fee-paying schools that are set up as a charity and mean that they have to treat their income from education as VAT exempt.
That's very interesting, Julian. I clearly undersold the podcast as there's a potential wider audience out there.
Absolutely.
Although I'm assuming I'm assuming that if these changes were brought in by a future Labour government, they would aim to target them purely on the independent schools which they are looking to.
You would hope so, yeah. I mean, that certainly seems to be what the intention, as much as we've had any detail on it, is stated to be. It's purely at that fee-paying school sector. But if we stop and think about it, it's really going to depend upon how the legislation that brings that massive change into place is drafted, and the wording will no doubt be pored over if this comes to pass, to see whether it's going to pull in, for example, special schools who provide education for those children who can't attend a mainstream provision, but who charge a fee for doing so, either to local authorities or perhaps to families as well, because those don't seem to be the sorts of organisations that the Labour Party intends to impact with this change. But they would be pulled in if the legislation is drafted poorly. So we don't know.
Understood. So our working assumption might be that they are probably going to attempt to carve those types of institutions out of the provision. But even assuming that's successful, I think from our experience of VAT and other taxes, we know that often in these situations there is either collateral damage on the one hand as a result of things applying in a way that they weren't intended to, or potential avenues for tax avoidance and loopholes as a result of the overcomplication of the legislation.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose the next thing really that would be helpful to know is, based on what we've been told, how do we anticipate these changes would be enacted, and what would be the VAT consequences of them for independent schools?
Well, we think that it would just be the fee raised for the provision of the actual education that would then be subject to standard rate VAT, which is currently 20%. Of course, it might be that the future Labour government introduce a new VAT rate applicable just to education, but let's assume the rate of 20% is what's applied to it. All schools that are in receipt of that income, VAT standard rated income, of £85,000 for a 12-month period or more would have to be VAT registered if they aren't already. A lot of them already are VAT registered. From that point onwards, they're going to have to account for that VAT to HM Revenue and Customs. So they need to pay over the 20% VAT that they collect from parents over to HMRC. How much of that 20% they actually pass on to the parents is up to the school to decide. So if they were minded to, it might be that they kept their fees at the current level that they've already set at and just account for VAT out of the income they receive. It might be that they choose to increase their fees by the full 20% or somewhere between 20% and no change at all. It will depend on the particular school's own profile and modelling. And the reason for that is because once they're VAT registered and they're accounting for VAT on their fee income, they will be able to start claiming back VAT on costs that they haven't previously been able to do so. So at the moment, those independent schools that are already VAT registered tend to be able to recover no more than 5% of the VAT that they incur on expenditure. But with this change, that recovery rate will increase dramatically to somewhere north of 90% probably. So there is an upside to it.
Because the school fees are the predominant supply that they're making.
Absolutely, yeah. The biggest cost that schools have, though, is generally their salary costs for all of their staff. And those don't bear VAT, of course. So there's no upside with that. However, capital expenditure, which is again a big expense for most schools where they have big sites, particularly often listed properties on their sites, the cost of maintaining or constructing new capital buildings will bear VAT, and that will start to become recoverable for them.
There's clearly a huge amount there, Gilly. It's going to be a real sea change for this sector. From your discussions to date with clients in this sector, what sort of things have you been talking to them about, and what are the kinds of things that they are thinking about doing to prepare themselves for these potential changes?
Well, it's been quite varied because, of course, we are still dealing in an unknown circumstance in this current time. And there's been a raft of, as one might expect, social media response to this proposed change, some of which suggests...
All well informed.
Oh, absolutely. Man down the pub. It's advising or suggesting that there are all sorts of wheezes that might be undertaken to get around having to charge VAT to families. But on a serious note, the starting point really is to model the impact of this for the school, not least from a cash flow perspective. And we have been doing some work with that with some of our colleagues to try and make sure that the school understands what banking requirements they're going to need in order to manage the VAT payments that they'll be making to HM Revenue and Customs. And also that will then feed into their decisions about how much of that 20% increase they may pass on to their families. On a really practical note, and if this isn't already the case, I would strongly recommend that anyone who might be affected reviews the terms and conditions that they have in place for their education provision. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that you're able legally and contractually to actually charge VAT. So you need to make sure that when you're stating your prices, they show that they are VAT exclusive. How much of that VAT, as we've said, you choose to pass on is up to you, but that gives you the ability to add VAT. If you don't say anything at all, or you state that they are VAT inclusive, then you're going to have to account the VAT out of the fee that you've quoted. That's the first thing I think to do. Once you've done your modelling, check your terms and conditions. And this is probably the time to be doing that, in fairness, because if you're going to change your terms and conditions, it seems sensible to me and entirely justifiable to look to implement that from the start of the next academic year. So looking at it now at the start of 2024 with a view to bringing that in from September 2024 gives you a reasonable lead time to make that change. And the other thing we've been speaking to some clients about is those who have got large scale capital projects. So conversions, constructions, refurbishments, anything, all of these will have, costs of the hundreds of thousands plus VAT on them. If it is possible to defer those from a practical perspective until after the change, that will be beneficial because then you'll be able to claim more of the VAT back on those capital expenditure projects. If you do them now, and that's perfectly fine, lots of non-VAT reasons, a lot of capital spend happens in the summer holidays because that's when it's easiest. As you said, we don't know when the election may happen or when the new government may take effect. But let's assume it's in the autumn. You're having to do your capital work in the summer, then that's when you have to do it. Don't let, what's that lovely expression we use? Don't let the tax tail wag the dog.
Tax tail wag the
That's right.
Commercial dog, yep.
So then you won't be able to recover very much of the VAT that you incur now. You'll be looking at your 1 to 5% VAT recovery, very low. But once you become VAT registered, you should be able to claim more of that VAT back over time. So it's not as beneficial if you have to incur your spend now, but it's not the end of the world either. So that's something to think about. And having gone through VAT registration with independent schools just because they've happened to breach the VAT registration threshold previously, the really painful part that can often be underestimated is the changes that will be needed to your finance systems and the training that your staff will need to understand how VAT works in your organisation. That will be a big learning curve. Don't underestimate it. Be speaking to whoever your finance system provider is earlier rather than later so that you're near the top of the queue. And of course, we're able to provide training and assistance with all of that as well.
And it is a special position that they're in effectively because many of our clients are either VAT registered and subject to VAT on all of their outputs already. We have clients who are in exempt sectors, but for something like an independent school, moving from a largely exempt environment to a largely taxable environment, that is an absolute sea change for them, isn't it, in terms of systems and procedures and the assistance and support they may require to implement them.
I mean, we won't have seen, or I won't anyway, in all of my years in VAT, have seen a change like this. It's going to be new territory for all of us.
We look forward to that with some trepidation then, but
yeah.
The initial planning steps you've mentioned are what are needed to put schools in the best possible position, aren't they, to be able to adapt. And is there anything that parents or families of students could consider? For example, is there a possibility for them to offer to pay fees up front if they are able to do so, to get another year's worth of fees paid for on a basis before they become subject to VAT?
That's a possibility, and it's something that I think some schools are talking to their families about doing. Clearly, it will depend to some extent how far through their school career your children are, and whether that's 1 or 2 years worth of fees or 10 or more. The really key thing will be that the payment of those advance fees has to actually be a payment to the school, not a promise. And the school will need to have access to those funds to do with as it wishes. So it can't be the situation where you say, well, I'll pay all of these now, but if little Johnny decides to leave, then I'd like some of them back. Or I would like to be able to borrow against them or some other complicated arrangement. It has to be a genuine payment that's made now. That we think would work to get you the VAT exemption. There's a possibility that any potential Labour government could introduce some complicated anti-forestalling rules, which would catch those sorts of early payments. I think that's unlikely, in my opinion, if they have been genuinely made. But again, another area of uncertainty for us to deal with. I guess it's easier if you've perhaps got grandparents or a trust who are paying them. It might be a bit more possible for those to be paid in a large lump sum than out of earned income by the family.
Because in a way, we've talked about many of the technical and practical aspects of it, but one thing that is probably the case is that there's a whole range of independent schools, and within it, independent schools, there's a whole range of parents and families with different social and economic backgrounds, isn't there? And it's really difficult to think that there's a one-size-fits-all approach. In some cases, there's probably quite an ability to absorb additional fees by parents in some schools, depending on their circumstances. In others, potentially very little. In other cases, the fees might be heavily supported by an employer or a third party, or they may even be, the Crown in the case of certain Crown employees. So that's really a further complication, isn't it? That, how schools plan and how parents plan is really going to come down to a lot of specifics concerning the school, the parents, and the pupils, which make simple solutions not really viable.
Yeah. And also make any kind of reliable forecasting of what the potential tax take of this change may be, because, as you say, there's no one size fits all calculation or easy formula that you can apply across schools and across families who use them. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I think I've come to appreciate that in the course of this discussion, Gilly, because really you might have thought simplistically that it's a question of 20% VAT applied to existing fees, or thinking a step further, maybe it won't quite be that, because schools will have to take into account affordability concerns of parents. So it'd be somewhere between where they are now and the 20%. But the way you've explained it, I can see there's a whole range of other factors, including any potential VAT recovery that's available by the school, different approaches that might be taken, positions of school with regard to capital expenditure plans, and all of these kind of things will affect that. So I would imagine, as you say, that the amount of additional tax revenues raised from this will be extremely difficult to forecast.
Yeah, very difficult. And we know that schools have been really pushing their charitable objects and open access to the community to support the fact that they've got charitable status in most cases. Whether this change will make them kind of draw up the drawbridge a bit, who knows? There's also the potential repercussion for any bursaries that schools offer. For those where the bursary is held in a separate foundation, which is the case for some schools that I know of, that foundation, which is itself usually a charitable trust, will then be paying VAT for fees to support children who are deserving to be attending that school and wouldn't otherwise be able to. And of course, the amount that the bursary is going to have to fund will be 20% more than it was previously, or whatever percentage the school put on. So there's a knock-on implication for those sorts of foundation arrangements as well that may not have been thought about.
Yeah, a huge range of factors there, really, aren't they, that are all intertwined. I guess probably a non-VAT point, in the sense that the changes that are being made are restricted broadly to VAT as well, aren't they? They do. Business rates position of independent schools is another part of this, but it is not a withdrawal of the charitable status of independent schools. It is these targeted measures. So for other tax purposes, the schools remain charities for the time being and able to take advantage of the charitable exemptions that apply to them, for example, from corporation tax.
Yeah. And interesting you've mentioned rates, because yes, that's another factor of the Labour manifesto, we believe. But that change to remove rates relief from independent schools is already in place in Scotland. So we know that that is possible. It's already happened. So that feels like less of a controversial change, perhaps, than this change to the treatment of the fees.
There's a blueprint to follow and lessons to be learned in implementing that, whereas the VAT is breaking new ground, or will be breaking new ground if it is introduced. Excellent. I think that's really helpful, Gilly, in raising awareness of this. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about the long-term repercussions of these changes or anything else you'd like to highlight whilst we have this opportunity.
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, Dominic, when you said that there's a real variety of schools that may be impacted. And I think the mainstream media focus on those big names, Eton, Harrow, public schools that everybody's familiar with. But how they will be affected is entirely different to how some of our smaller, more local independent schools will be impacted, and it's really not something that can be read straight across one to the other, especially with the different families attending those as well. And I just do hope, if I have one hope for this, if this change does come to pass, is that the legislative drafting is very, very carefully thought out, because I would hate for those fee-paying providers of special educational needs provision to be impacted, or even charities who undertake a range of benefits for the community, one of which happens to be some provision of education, if they were impacted by this as well. I think that isn't what's intended, but it would really hamper the efforts of the third sector at the point in time when, as a society, we're relying increasingly on those organisations.
I think that's a really important point. Gilly, thank you very much for explaining that all so clearly, and thank you for your time. I hope that's been helpful to anyone listening to the podcast. If you do want to get in touch, our contact details are provided in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Larking Gowen Insights, Accountancy and Business Advice for All. Don't forget, you can find more information about today's topic and more about how our team of experts can help you in your business by visiting our website, larking-gowen.co.uk. Join us again next time for another fascinating insight into the world of accounting and finance.